Why living close to your children in old age could be a big mistake. Margaret Lewis had always believed that family was the cornerstone of happiness. For 74 years, that belief had guided every decision she made. She raised three children in the same small town, attended every recital, every football game, every school conference. Her husband, Richard, used to joke that she could hear one of their children sneeze from 3 miles away. When he passed away, her children became her world even more. So, when her youngest daughter, Lisa, suggested that she sell her house and move closer to one of them so we can take care of you, Margaret didn't hesitate. At first, it seemed like the right thing to do. Lisa and her husband had built a new home in the suburbs, complete with a cozy granny flat above the garage. "You'll have your own space, Mom," Lisa said. "You'll never be lonely again." That promise, the idea that she would never feel alone, filled Margaret's heart with warmth. She imagined holidays together, spontaneous coffee chats, her grandchildren dropping by after school. She sold the family home, packed up her memories, and moved. The first few weeks were pleasant enough. Lisa made a show of stopping by every evening, sometimes bringing dinner or asking Margaret to join them at the main house. The grandchildren were excited too. They'd run up the stairs to her little flat and tell her about school, their laughter echoing down the hall. But slowly, subtly, the tone of everything began to change. Lisa's visits grew shorter. The grandchildren stopped coming up so often, distracted by their friends and screens. Margaret began to realize that living close didn't necessarily mean being close. She could hear the muffled sounds of their lives through the walls, the clinking of dinner plates, the laughter during family movie nights, but she wasn't always invited. And when she was, she felt more like an obligation than a guest. One evening, Lisa came up with her usual forced smile. "Mom," she began, "you know we love having you here, right? But I need to ask, could you maybe give us a bit more notice before coming over? Sometimes you drop in when we're busy, and it's just hard to juggle everything." Margaret nodded, embarrassed. She hadn't realized her attempts to stay connected were intrusive. From that day on, she waited for invitations that rarely came. Over the following months, a quiet resentment began to build. Not from Margaret alone. She noticed it in Lisa too. Every small request, every question about the children's lives seemed to irritate her daughter. Margaret couldn't understand it. Wasn't this what family was for? Hadn't she spent decades nurturing the very people who now seemed eager to keep her at arm's length? The days stretched longer. Margaret began filling her time with small routines, morning walks around the cul-de-sac, tea at precisely 4, old movies in the evenings. But it wasn't the same. She had imagined companionship, laughter, shared moments. Instead, she had become a ghost living beside the living. One Sunday, she overheard Lisa and her husband talking downstairs. The words weren't meant for her, but they floated up through the open window. "I just feel guilty," Lisa said. "She's here all the time, and I barely see her. But I also can't handle the pressure. Every time I walk by that flat, I feel like I'm failing her." Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. It wasn't anger, more like grief. She had come here to be closer, but in doing so, she had become a reminder of everything her daughter didn't have time for. The relationship that once felt natural and loving now felt loaded with guilt and unspoken expectations. The next week, Margaret decided to visit her eldest son, Peter, who lived 2 states away. Peter had always been the pragmatic one, the kind of man who rarely sugarcoated anything. When she told him about her life beside Lisa, he listened quietly, nodding in all the right places. Finally, he said, "Mom, maybe living close isn't the same as living connected. You raised us to be independent, to have our own lives. Maybe it's time you did the same again, for yourself." Margaret stayed with Peter and his wife for 2 weeks. During that time, she noticed something remarkable. When there was distance, their relationship was lighter. They laughed more, argued less. She wasn't part of their daily routine, So every interaction felt intentional, appreciated. There was freedom in that space for both sides. When she returned to Lisa's, the tension returned almost immediately. Lisa was polite but distracted, her husband courteous but distant. Margaret realized then that love had boundaries and proximity sometimes blurred them in painful ways. It wasn't anyone's fault, just a quiet truth that families rarely spoke about. By Christmas, she had made up her mind. She found a small apartment in a nearby town, close enough for visits, but far enough for peace. Lisa was surprised at first, almost offended. "Mom, are you unhappy here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Margaret smiled. "No, dear. I'm just giving us both a little space to breathe." The weeks after her move were some of the most liberating of her life. She joined a local book club, met neighbors who shared her love for gardening, even started volunteering at the library. Slowly, she began to rediscover who she was outside of being mom or grandma. And something beautiful happened. Her relationship with her children began to heal. Now, when Lisa called, it was out of genuine interest, not obligation. When Margaret visited, she was welcomed warmly. The grandchildren talked to her with excitement again, showing her their drawings or telling her about school projects. The guilt that had once weighed over every interaction was gone. Margaret often reflected on that strange paradox, how moving closer to her children had nearly torn them apart, while creating distance had brought them back together. She realized that independence wasn't just for the young. It was a lifelong necessity, a way to preserve dignity, purpose, and love. One afternoon, sitting in her sunlit apartment with a cup of tea, Margaret wrote in her journal, "Love should be a bridge, not a chain. Sometimes we hold on too tightly and mistake it for closeness, but real love allows space for both hearts to keep growing." Years later, when her health began to decline, she faced another round of decisions. Her children offered to take her in, each wanting to repay what she had given them. But Margaret gently refused. "I've seen what happens when we mix love with daily duty," she said with a smile. "Visit me often, love me deeply, but let me live freely." When she finally passed, peacefully in her sleep at 86, her children gathered in her little apartment. They found her journal on the table, the page marked with that same line she had written years ago. Lisa read it aloud through tears, realizing for the first time that her mother had been right all along. Closeness of heart mattered more than closeness of distance. The story of Margaret Lewis became, in its quiet way, a reminder to her children, and to many others, that sometimes love flourishes best when it is given room to breathe. Parents and children need each other, but they also need their own spaces to live, to fail, to grow. The instinct to stay physically close is strong, especially as years pass and loneliness threatens. But emotional connection cannot be forced by geography. Margaret's choice taught her family that independence in old age isn't selfish, it's an act of love. It prevents resentment, preserves respect, and keeps relationships rooted in choice rather than obligation. She had learned that moving closer can sometimes mean losing sight of oneself, and that the truest closeness often comes from knowing when to step back. In the end, Margaret's legacy wasn't measured in the miles between her and her children, but in the strength of the invisible bond that distance could never weaken. She had lived enough life to understand a truth few dared to admit. Living too close to your children in old age might seem like safety, but sometimes it's the surest way to lose the very connection you're trying to save.